You know, I've been reading Marcus Aurelius' Meditations.
Wow, you're talking about one of the great
This guy was
books of all
2,000 years ago.
And he was the most powerful man in the world.
And he was so brilliant and so, like, the way his philosophy on things, like, about forgiving people, like, so unexpected. Like,
Yes.
so much of what he was saying.
Well, we're still talking about it.
Yeah.
All this time.
Still
it's
relates
still
to
such
today.
a relevant book.
Dude, it's so good. It's so good. And
Brilliant.
I listened to it in the sauna. It's really intense because you're thinking that these are the writings, the direct writings that we have from a guy who lived 2,000 years ago and was running Rome.
That's insane.
It's
More
really,
than 2,000 years ago, wasn't it? I think he was.
it was close. It's in the neighborhood.
But, you know, he's talking about a man who was the most
What year
powerful
was
man in the
Meditations
world
written?
and was preaching
The most powerful, probably the smartest man, right?
I looked this
Self-control.
up. They don't. The translations are all different because it wasn't found or
Right.
mentioned until like way after he was alive.
Right, but what year did he write it?
That's the
What year was he alive?
121 to 180.
There you go. So somewhere between that range. So somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 years.
Hot second ago.
2,000 other years.
2000.
That's
Think about
that's
that.
crazy.
We're
that
still
he was
talking
Just dropping knowledge.
Oh,
But it's so applicable to the way you think. It's so applicable and so, like, beneficial if you can adopt a lot of his thought process.
and not a long book, like, you know.
There's no mention of meditations until the early 10th century. Whoa. The historian Herodian, writing in the mid-3rd century, makes mentions of Marcus's literary legacy, saying that he was concerned with all aspects of excellence. And in his love of ancient literature, he was second to no man, Roman or Greek. This is evident from all of his sayings and writings which have come down to us, a passage which may refer to meditation. So that was like one of the first times anybody referred to
Handsome
the book.
bastard or what? What are we talking about here?
We have no idea.
So I recently saw you on Instagram posting about Marcus Aurelius.
Yes.
And so I want to, can we veer to that for a
Sure,
second?
please.
So in the next book that I'm doing, The Recipe for a Good Life, of course, I get into the history of all sorts of cultures that have explored the good life. It's not as though I'm the first guy to write about this. Probably one of the topics that's been most written about. None have been as prolific as the ancient Greeks. And so when I saw your thing about Marcus Aurelius, I was about to write you to say, well, I've come to that same realization because, so as I was doing my research for the book, every time I would get an insight that I thought was original to me, I'd say, that fucker Epictetus has already said it 2,000 years ago.
Isn't that wild?
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
Yeah,
right?
it's
And so it
crazy.
reminds me, and I want to give him kudos on the show. So do you know who Nassim Taleb is?
Sure.
Yeah, so Nassim is a good friend of mine. He's a fellow Lebanese. And so many years ago, he was kind of egging me, teasing me, saying, I don't really understand what you study in psychology, Gad. Everything that there is to know about psychology and human nature, the ancient Greeks have already covered it. And so I mean, he was just egging me on. But then many years later, as I'm preparing for this book, I'm like, I think he might be right. We might be empirically validating what they've already philosophized. But so your post about Marcus Aurelius really resonated with me at exactly that same moment.
It's quite fascinating when you read his writings.
It's unbelievable.
Because he was so wise, and his decisions for what he would concentrate on and not concentrate on, and how he would accept people's flaws and mistakes that they'd made as if they had never made them, and this just approach to Stoicism and his philosophy on life. The Greeks and the Romans, and if you look at the history of these ancient civilizations that dominated the world at that period of time, and we can get a kind of an understanding of how they thought about things. It's, to me, one of the more amazing things about history is to peer into it's almost like we have a little bit of a time machine to peer into the mindset of these people that were so wise thousands and thousands of years ago, and that their words are applicable today.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that speaks to the universality of the human condition, right? So I always tell my students when I'm teaching about evolutionary theory, I say, look, you can use cultural products as fossils of the human mind, right? The human mind doesn't fossilize, but the products that is left from human minds, we can study its contents in the same way that paleontologist studies fossil remains. So I can connect to the mind of an ancient Greek poet and understand what he's talking about as though he's speaking today. because the software that's running his mind and mine is identical. He doesn't know what an iPhone is. He doesn't know what a podcast is, but he knows about sexual longing. He knows about paternity uncertainty. He knows about sibling rivalry. Those are the universal themes that are invariant across time and place. And so one of the things that I love about being an author is that I get to be connected through ideas with all of these immortal souls, you know? And so it's really a beautiful thing to write and to create, and that the fact that I independently thought of something that Epictetus thought 2,000 years ago connects me with him.
Yes, truth. It's just you developed an understanding of human beings and of human nature, and you have deciphered from this and extracted some truth, and it turns out other people have done the same thing.
It's fantastic.
It is fantastic. You know, there's a great book called the what is it? Immortality Code. And it's Brian Murarescu, he's gone through ancient Greek culture and all of the Eleusinian mysteries, and looked into all of their rituals and tried to figure out like what was going on. And one of the things that they've done is going over pottery and finding that there's remnants of psychedelic substances in these pottery jars. And so these wine jars, these jugs, these as pottery, they found that they were imbibing in wine that was dosed with lysergic acid.
Wow.
So they had different kinds of ergot and different kinds of things that would produce psychedelic states. So all of these, you know, like when people would go there to learn, and when people would go to have these ritualistic experiences, they were tripping. And this is the birthplace of democracy. This is the birthplace of a lot of these thinkers, these great thinkers of that age. And of course, Roman emperors forbade it, and they outlawed it, and they in the book they sort of detail how it migrated to other countries, and you can find the same remnants in the pottery in these other countries, and you can literally you could track the path of their escape from these areas where they were more restrictive and trying these ritualistic experiences in other places. But
Yeah.
it's the immortality key or code key, the immortality key. It's an amazing book, really, really. And Brian was on the podcast, and because of him being on the podcast, Harvard has opened up a field of study.
Wow.
In that particular area where they're looking at psychedelic substance use in ancient Greece, because it's irrefutable now. Because of the residue, they now have scientific evidence. They have residue that shows that they were most certainly flavoring their wine with this stuff. That's another thing that I didn't know. I always thought wine was wine. It was fermented fruit. It's not. Their wine, they would always add things to. They constantly added stuff to their wine. Their wine was never just wine. Their wine was most of the time wine with other things, and oftentimes psychedelic substances like ergot mixed in with the wine.
So I knew I wanted to be a writer, and when I first read the Stoics, I was just like, shit, this is it. Like, when I read Meditations for the first time, I was 19, I was sitting in my college apartment, and I was just like, not only have I never read anything like this, I've never even heard of anything like this. Because you have the most powerful man in the world writing notes to himself that he never thinks are going to be published. Like, pretty much every other book ever written was like a writer writing to an audience.
Yeah.
And Meditations was never intended to be published. He'd probably be mortified that we even have it. And so it was just a kind of philosophy and a way of thinking that I hadn't heard in any school, in any class from any adult in my life. And I was like, I want to tell people about this.
Marcus Aurelius, one of the more interesting things about the stuff that he writes is how relevant it is today. Like when you read it, you wouldn't imagine that this is being written by a man. Like, how many years ago was that?
1900, 2,000 years ago. He's writing in like the mid 150s, 160s AD.
It's very relevant. Like the way he writes, it's the language is incredibly familiar. It's the same, It's one of the things about we would always make fun of the way people talked a long time ago. Wherefore art thou? Like there's a way of talking that we don't communicate like today. But when Marcus Aurelius writes, and if you read Meditations, it seems very current.
Well, it does depend on the translation, right? Because if you were reading, and people do this, I'll recommend Marcus Aurelius, and they'll just get what's free on the internet or whatever. If you're reading a translation from the 1850s or the 1600s, it's going to be in Shakespearean English because
interesting,
right? Because they're translating it into their
vernacular.
Parlance. Yeah. And so the right translation is key. Do you remember which one you read?
I don't.
I like that. There's a Gregory Hayes translation for the Modern Library, which I think is the most lyrical and beautiful of all of them. That's the one that I randomly bought on Amazon and had no idea that it was going to be the one that would hit me.
So were the original ones in Latin?
So this is what's crazy about Marcus. So Marcus lives in Rome. The Romans speak Latin, but the philosophical language at that time was Greek. So Marcus was writing to himself in Greek. So it gives it, when you read those passages or you listen to them and you're just like, that is one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard. There's this one passage where he talks about a stalk of grain bending low under its own weight, the way an olive, falls to the ground. He talks about the way that when you put bread in the oven, it breaks open on top, and we don't know why that happens. It's just this beautiful inadvertent act of nature. He's just writing like a poet, like a great writer. And again, he's writing in his non-native tongue to himself, never expecting anyone would see it. How fucking talent. It'd be like finding out it's a comedian is funny in their diary. You're just wow, you're just naturally that. You're not turning it on or off.
Right.
It's just intuitively part of you.
Yeah.
But I think your point about how it feels timeless, that actually does feel like a thing I've heard comedians say, which is that the specific is universal. I don't think he was trying to talk to the audience. I think he was so unflinchingly honest with himself that he was touching something universally human. And that's why, because we should not be able to relate to his experience at all.
Right.
I mean, there is literally a cult of the emperor that worshipped the emperor and their spouse as living deities. And he controlled the largest army in the world. He had unlimited wealth. He could kill or murder or torture or exile anyone he wanted. People cheered him as he walked in the streets. There's no way we should be able to be this passage where he's talking about struggling to get out of bed in the morning and you want to huddle under the warm covers. How? Because I guess people are people no matter where you get in life.
People are people, and not everyone gives in to the temptations of being in that position.
Mm-hmm.
And in his case, I think it made him more apt to reflect upon his thoughts and find the source of why he believed what he believed and why he thought what he thought.
Yeah, he says in Meditations, he says, be careful not to be Caesarified. Don't be dyed purple. Because the emperor wore a purple cloak. And purple, if now we're just the color purple. To get purple, it was this complicated process of different merchants. Actually, the founder of Stoicism was a merchant in Tyrian purple, but slaves would smash up sea slugs or sea snails, dry them on rocks, and this dust would eventually become the source of purple.
Oh.
So, and he's don't be stained purple. So he was acting when he becomes emperor, he's this will change you if you're not careful. And you have to actively work to make sure that doesn't happen. So he was aware of that.
That was the character in Gladiator, right? Wasn't that Marcus Aurelius? Was it based on him, roughly, loosely?
Well, it's I think one of the great movies of all time. But
it's a great movie. But Peter O'Toole?
Yes. He's the one that Joaquin Phoenix's character kills at the beginning. And then a lot of the sort of things that Maximus says are sort of very Stoic inspired. The irony of that movie is that Joaquin Phoenix probably underplays how bad Marcus Aurelius' son was in real life.
Really?
He really did get killed by a gladiator. he was a psychopath, immediately destroys all of Marcus's work. It's one of the tragedies of Marcus that he has a POS son.
I've always wondered, like, how that seemed like it's Joffrey from Game of Thrones. Like, that is a very common thing.
Yeah.
Why is that, like, it's an archetype?
It is. There's another great Eastern emperor, Cyrus the Great, and he has a shitty son too. It doesn't look like Queen Elizabeth's kids are that great. But what's interesting about Marcus is, like, it's weird that he's such this great man, and then most people know nothing about him. But, like, Marcus's father was not emperor. So there's what they call the 5 good emperors. So there's basically, in all of Roman history, there's like 5 good emperors, and they happen in a row. And they happen in a row because each one does not have a male heir. So they don't have sons. So in the Roman tradition, it was much more common to, if you didn't have a son, you would adopt a son. And so the Emperor Hadrian is old, probably gay, does not have any children, and he adopts. He sees something in Marcus. Marcus is young, but he sort of starts mentoring this boy. They actually go, like, hunting together. Like, he sees something special in this kid. Marcus's nickname was Verismus, or the truthful one. But he's, like, just a kid. And Hadrian realizes he's too young to name him emperor. So he selects a man named Antoninus Pius, who's the great politician of the time, and makes him emperor on condition that he adopt Marcus Aurelius. So Marcus, and then the thinking was Antoninus Pius would live for like 5 years, and then Marcus would be king. And in fact, he lives for like 19 years. So Marcus has like a 20-year apprenticeship in being the emperor under a man who like could have killed him, who could have been corrupted by power, but is this incredible example. And that's why at the beginning of Meditations, Marcus has like a 2-page thank you letter to Antoninus, his adopted stepfather.
Oh, wow.
It's fucking crazy.
And his son, what was the deal with the wife?
Marcus's wife?
Yes.
So Marcus's wife, Faustina, is, I guess it would be, Faustina is Antoninus's daughter. So they're not related, but they marry the family together. Marcus loves her. They're married a very long time. There are rumors that she's unfaithful, but as far as we know, Marcus pays, no attention to this, does not believe them. But the tragedy of their marriage is Marcus loses like 7 children before they reach adulthood.
Oh, wow.
Can you imagine that?
Well, that was very common back then, though, wasn't it?
7's a lot, though.
It is a lot, but isn't that's one of the reasons why the general age that people lived to was so low back then? People think that people died, your age of expected death. It wasn't that. It's just like you died in childbirth. You died, when you were young. You died from infection. It wasn't that people didn't live as long.
Yes. Like, there's lots of old people in Rome. Mm-hmm. It's just like getting
to that
over.
hump.
Like, if you made it to 40, maybe you can make it to 80.
Right.
But like, chances are you weren't going to make it to 20.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But
they're all sword fighting and shit.
That's also true. I mean, just imagine you could cut your hand and die of an infection.
Yeah, real. And obviously they're shitting in the streets and this fucking horrible.
Even rich
diseases.
people don't have toilets.
Yeah.
Like, they know nothing.
Yeah.
So that's one of the sort of, not rationalizations, but if you're like, how does it go so wrong that this great man leaves the empire to his son?
Yeah.
Well, he does have a male heir. That's a problem, unlike all his predecessors. But it's that every one of the sons that he wanted to succeed him died.
Oh.
And there's some speculation that Marcus's plan. So this is the other crazy thing about Marcus. If I'm nerding out, you can.
No, please go.
So Marcus has a stepbrother. Through this crazy adoption process, he has a stepbrother. And so that he inherits through Hadrian. It's a complicated thing, but he has a stepbrother. And so, like, we know what kings do to their rivals. Like, you have to kill them, right? The first emperor of Rome, Octavian, he's Julius Caesar's nephew, Julius Caesar has a half son with Cleopatra, or he has a half brother or whatever. He has a son with Cleopatra, a son out of wedlock. And Octavian has 2 Stoic teachers who instruct him to murder his rival, which he promptly does, or have murdered. So the precedent was like, you can't have too many Caesars. Like, you can't have more than one viable heir. And Marcus, when he's Antoninus' favorite, Antoninus preps him, he ascends to the throne. The first thing Marcus does is he names his brother Lucius Verus co-emperor, which is not only never happened basically before or since, it is a nod to how the Republic was. The Republic of Rome, before it becomes a monarchy, is led by 2 consuls, like 2 elected presidents who serve together as a check against power. So Marcus, by naming, he can't put it back to a republic, which is the plot of Gladiator. He can name himself a co-emperor, and the thinking is that's what he was planning to do with his sons, but they all died.
So in the movie, Joaquin Phoenix kind of kills the dad.
He kills the dad because Marcus does not know. In the movie, not in real life, Marcus Aurelius knows his son cannot be king.
But in real life,
he passes it to him.
So, and how did Marcus Aurelius die?
Of the plague.
Oh, wow.
So that's the other crazy, again, timeless. Marcus was writing in what we now call the Antonine Plague. They named it after him. But it's like a global pandemic. It starts in the East, overwhelms Rome. 5-10 million people die. They have no way of stopping it. So Marcus leads through all of that. And then the suspicion is that he catches it at the end, realizes he has it, has to send his son away so he doesn't give it to his son, sets in motion like a series of advisors who should lead his son, and then his son promptly gets rid of all of them and goes bad.
So how does a man like that, who's so introspective and so thoughtful, particularly for the times, how does a man like that have a son that's such a piece of shit?
I don't know. I mean, one argument is he's a psychopath and there's sort of nothing you can do. There's no blame whatsoever. The other argument, the more likely one, is most great men, and we're talking about history, so it's mostly great men, but again, Queen Elizabeth has crappy kids. Most great men are shitty fathers. Gandhi was a bad father. Winston Churchill was not a good father.
Why is that?
I think they're busy.